From human arms to robot limbs, it revolutionized the way we work. From couch potato to video game warrior, transformed the way we play. And from staring at the moon to walking on it, changed our view of the universe. They're all inventions of the 1960s, a decade of protest, free love, and Cold War rivalry that turned science fiction into solid fact. From robots to the taser to the spaceship that took us to the moon, they're the inventions that shook the world. When to stay put and when to run from nature's fury. Knowing the answer can save your life. Satellites take away the guesswork. Thanks to a scientist who made it his mission to launch meteorological eyes in the sky. The year is 1944, and Dr. Harry Wexler is about to prove he's no ordinary meteorologist. A hurricane is bearing down on America's eastern seaboard. Wexler's planning to observe it by flying right into the eye of the storm.
Sir, are you ready for your flight?
I'll be right there.
No scientist has ever done this kind of first-hand research before.
But he was a pioneer, and he was willing to take a chance. Well, I think he was truly curious, and he thought that the plane could go out and bring back useful information.
Information needed to save lives. In the 40s, hurricanes are still a mystery.
There were no eyes in the sky. There was no way to tell what was out there except scattered ship reports, and that was not even in real time, so it was guesswork.
Harry Wexler is a curious and brilliant scientist, trained at Harvard and MIT. Mathematics is his specialty. Weather is his passion.
Harry Wexler never turned down a challenge. Harry was a gregarious, very outgoing kind of fellow, extremely smart, very bright, and was interested in just about everything that had to do with meteorology.
Wexler and his pilots plunge into the hurricane aboard a U.S. Air Force bomber, battling winds up to 200 kilometers an hour. When they reach the eye of the storm, the plane is suddenly sucked upward by strong vertical wind currents. Until this moment, scientists assumed hurricanes only had horizontal currents. It's a major leap forward for hurricane research. But it's not going to save any lives this time round. The hurricane sank 5 ships, killing 344 sailors. Dozens more people died when it made landfall. Saving lives means creating a hurricane warning system, and that means finding a way to track the hurricane long before it reaches land. Inspiration comes unexpectedly from the other side of the ocean. The British science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke has been following Wexler's research.
One day in the early 1950s, Harry Wexler opened his mail and had a letter from Arthur C. Clarke asking him his ideas about a meteorological satellite.
An idea ahead of its time. Satellites are still at the concept stage. The Americans and Soviets are in a fierce race to put one into orbit. But Wexler is intrigued.
That led Wexler to think about all the things you might be able to see from outer space, looking down on the atmosphere. Clarke really did lead Harry Wexler into a train of thought which was very fruitful and helped develop some of the early technologies for weather satellites.
Wexler imagines a satellite that could orbit high above the Earth, taking pictures of weather patterns while they're still forming. He pictures the satellite orbiting around the North and South poles, crossing the same lines of latitude at the same time every day. Each time it passes a particular point, it will take photographs and transmit them back to Earth. It will take a lot of resources to make Wexler's concept fly. He pitches his idea to everyone he knows in government. For several years, nothing happens. Then, in October 1957, the Soviets launch Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Now, America is playing catch-up. The time has come to put Wexler's idea into action. NASA starts building his weather satellite, Tyros-1.
Harry was right there, able to shape the early developments.
Wexler's plan calls for 2 cameras, a wide angle that can photograph 2,000 square kilometers at a time, and a high-resolution camera for close-ups. April 1st, 1960, Cape Canaveral, Florida. The countdown to launching Wexler's dream.
The dramatic moment of launching. All goes perfectly.
Tyros goes into orbit 800 kilometers above the Earth, circling the planet once every 99 minutes. Wexler waits anxiously for the first set of images. If the pictures are not clear enough to show weather patterns, the mission will be a failure. Turns out, the results are even better than he had dared hope.
The first pictures from Tyros, they clearly showed ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They showed cloud formations that could be matched to the storm theories of the time. This is actually a holy grail of meteorology.
But it's not until September 1961 that Tyros faces the ultimate test. Hurricane Carla is churning toward the Texas Gulf Coast.
Carla was the largest storm ever that landed on the U.S. soil. It's larger than Katrina.
Tyros photographs Carla brewing in the Gulf of Mexico, allowing meteorologists to track her. There's time to evacuate more than 500,000 people. Harry Wexler's vision is saving lives.
Harry's contemporaries called the weather satellite Harry's dream. Harry Wexler's contribution really marked a turning point in our quest to get a complete view of the Earth's weather, a view that can be shared internationally, that can cover the oceans and the southern hemisphere and remote areas. And so it really is the fulfillment of an ancient quest of the meteorologist.
A quest fulfilled, and the power to stay one step ahead of whatever's coming our way. Other inventions of the 1960s. 1968, the waterbed makes waves in bedrooms across the continent.
This is the latest American sensation in indoor living.
Marketed as a pleasure pit for free love and aspiring ladies' men. 1961, the Amphicar rides the waves. But the concept of a floating automobile sinks like a stone with consumers. 1963, the lava lamp casts a groovy glow thanks to a British inventor's brew of water, wax, and carbon tetrachloride. They work around the clock, never call in sick, and don't need a paycheck. Yet these robots do all the heavy lifting, thanks to an inventor who thought humans shouldn't have to. This is George Duvall's favorite place, his garage in Connecticut, where ideas percolate and inventions are born.
George Duvall was a serial inventor. He was a guy who chose not to go to college because he was so brilliant that he was capable of making a living just by coming up with inventions on his own.
By the mid-50s, George has helped invent all kinds of things, like the phantom doorman that uses a photoelectric cell to open doors. But these days, George is a bit on edge, keen to come up with a really big idea.
George Duval was kind of a nerdy guy who was really focused on the details. You know, he wasn't thinking about the big picture. He was really focused on how his inventions actually worked. And not so much on whether people would want to use them or what the applications were or anything like that, which is why he wasn't the greatest businessman.
Flipping through a tech journal, he sees an assembly line, an image of monotony that sets his imagination rolling. George wonders, why should human beings have to do such mind-numbing work?
You're doing that job again and again and again. And once you do it all day, human beings just lose concentration. And losing concentration meant that you could get injured, and people did.
George's inventor brain springs to life. What if workers' lives could be improved by a stand-in that does the dirty work? If that tool could move like a human arm, grab onto things and lift them up, its possible uses would be mind-boggling.
It had to be able to pick up heavy parts. It had to be dexterous, so it had to be able to get a hold of those parts and hang on to them and move them to another place and let go of them.
George imagines a machine with a wrist that can bend and rotate like a real hand. Two opposed fingers do the grasping. The arm's actions are controlled by a computer that can be reprogrammed for different jobs. George gets a patent, but he can't get anyone to listen to his idea.
He's really focused on details, he's really technically proficient, but he's not really very good at explaining what he's doing to anyone else.
His big break comes by chance at a friend's party.
George Duval, I'd like you to meet Joe Engelberger. I have a feeling you boys have a lot to talk about.
George, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Joe.
I think we need a drink.
Joe Engelberger, an engineer with a background in physics who also happens to be a very sharp businessman.
So, George, what line of work are you in?
Well, see, I have this idea.
The two get to talking, and Joe suddenly realizes that what George is describing is something that he's read about in science fiction, only it's real, a robot.
Very interesting.
Joe also grasps the business potential, all the possible uses for a robotic arm. It's the start of a beautiful relationship.
Come on in, Joe. This is it. I know it doesn't look like much, but we can clean all this stuff out of here.
George concentrates on building a working prototype and solving engineering problems along the way. Joe gets to work figuring out all the potential uses and buyers for a robotic arm.
He was going to factories and he was trying to figure out the lowest hanging fruit. Where can robots help first? So he was trying to identify really important jobs for robots. And that means jobs that people don't want to do.
One of their biggest engineering challenges, how to adjust the robot's grip so it can adapt to different jobs. The solution? Install pressure sensors inside the machine's hand. The heavier the pressure, the stronger the grip needs to be. The robot's movements are programmed into a computer.
You just move it through the motions, and then it would record that, and then it would play it back again and again and again, all night long, never going to sleep, never asking for a break.
They call their prototype the Unimate. They continue to refine and test it, proving that their invention can adapt to a multitude of tasks. seems like success should be a shoo-in. What George and Joe haven't counted on: robots have a big image problem in America.
At the time, robots were just like witches or werewolves. They were completely made up. It was just like any other boogeyman that was used to scare people in a story. When robots appeared in popular culture, they were typically killing everybody. So this is a tremendously difficult business problem.
America's lack of enthusiasm is disappointing. George and Joe will have to expand their horizons. In Japan, the post-war economy is booming.
In Japan, robots were much better perceived, and so there was no drawback for the Japanese companies to tell everybody, hey, we've got robots.
Japanese automakers start using unimates, and productivity booms. In the rest of the world, robot phobia gives way to a robot revolution.
This was a real turning point for humankind, because one minute we were just using tools, and the next minute we were letting our tools do their jobs on their own, completely autonomously.
In 2003, the Unimate is inducted into the Robot Hall of Fame. But it's George and Joe who deserve the real toast for figuring out you can make that robot do almost anything. Also invented in the 1960s? 1962, the touch-tone phone leaves rotary dial in the dust.
I beat you.
1963, the rocket belt hoists military pilots into the air on a blast of steam. But they run out of fuel in 21 seconds, so the concept never stays aloft. 1964, AstroTurf,
a significant improvement on nature.
Plastic grass that turns a bath of mud into a field of green. From couch potato to video warrior, an unimaginable leap in the early days of television. Interacting with your set was science fiction, until one brilliant American invented the game box. By the 1960s, Ralph Baer has already made his mark as an electronics wizard. After escaping from Nazi Germany as a teenager, his scientific genius has flourished in post-war America.
Ralph Baer is one of the finest examples I can think of inventive ingenuity. Ralph was the kind of person who was constantly thinking, 5 to 7 steps ahead of everybody else in society.
In the late 40s and 50s, Ralph creates everything from hi-fi accessories to snooping devices to monitor the Soviets. He's also convinced television could be less passive and more interactive. A radical concept in the 50s, so no one will listen.
At this point in time, it was absolutely insane to try to think of reacting to a television set in any way other than just viewing, in any way other than just being spoon-fed by whatever the networks or the small independent companies thought they could feed you. Basically, it was a medium where you just took it in. You had no say in what you saw, except for changing channels. And in those days, you didn't have that many channels to change.
In 1966, Ralph's doing equipment design for a military contractor. He's working with an alignment generator that puts test lines on a TV screen.
You had these testers that would put crosshatches of horizontal lines and vertical lines on the screen so that you could test them and make sure they were working.
The machine inspires him to imagine a whole new kind of game.
He realized this would be really fun if we could put it in the user's hands and the user could play with it. What if I could bounce those lines around? What if I could chase a dot around on the screen?
But to turn his idea into reality, he needs to find a way to generate a signal that will turn those static lines into symbols that can move around on the screen. September 1966. Ralph's at a bus stop. when everything starts coming together.
Ralph pulls out his spiral-bound notebook. He starts making notes. He creates this memo. In the first page, he visualizes, a whole gamut of game types that could be useful in video games.
Ralph realizes that if a radio frequency, or RF signal, can display moving pictures on a TV screen, it should also be able to generate game symbols.
You getting on, buddy?
Ralph knows his idea will be a tough sell at the office, where the focus is on serious military technology. So he starts developing his TV game in secret.
At this point in time, Ralph has enough people reporting to him and enough budget to be able to disguise what he's doing.
Ralph gets to work using the components of an alignment generator. He uses a radio frequency oscillator to generate a video signal. Then, a component called a sync generator synchronizes that signal into one that the television understands. A modulator then sends the signal to the TV and places it on channel 3 or 4. As the signal enters the TV, a spot appears on the screen, which can move horizontally, vertically, and change shape. He's proven that his concept works. Next, Ralph constructs an actual game box. But it isn't user-friendly. He's used glass vacuum tubes to regulate the flow of electricity. They take up too much space, and they blow out.
You couldn't put out a consumer game unit that was based on vacuum tubes because, they would blow out and you would have to replace the tubes.
Luckily, new technology keeps Ralph moving forward. He enlists a talented coworker, Bill Harrison, who knows all about transistors. Tiny silicon semiconductors that perform the same function as vacuum tubes, but without the bulk or the blowouts. They'll make Ralph's game box a whole lot smaller and more user-friendly. The prototype game box is ready for action. Each game comes with a plastic overlay, like this ping pong table, to make things more realistic.
This way, gentlemen.
June 1967. Ralph and his co-worker decide they're ready to unveil his secret project to the bosses.
He was tired of hiding all of the expenses in the budget, and he hoped that maybe he could loosen some of the purse strings.
There's no way of knowing how they're going to react to something that was built on the sly. At first, the executives don't know what to make of Ralph's game. But once they get the hang of it, they're hooked.
Imagine, if you will, two men with military experience, all the maturity that you expect to see, but here they are playing on a television screen with all the intensity as though their life's prestige depends upon it. That's the way it was in that 10 by 20 room.
Ralph's boss hands over $2,000 for staff and $500 for parts, so Ralph can take the game box to the next level.
Imagine that. The video game revolution began on $2,500 worth of R&D money.
Ralph's TV game box becomes the Magnavox Odyssey, the world's first home video game console.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
It hits the shelves in 1972, and over the next decade, Ralph's idea transforms the home entertainment business.
I don't think he would have dreamed that he was creating an industry that would be in the billions of dollars by this time today.
In 2006, Ralph receives the prestigious National Medal of Technology in honor of his video game inventions from none other than the president himself. Other inventions of the 1960s. 1964, G.I. Joe, the action figure that makes it cool for boys to play with dolls. 1960. The hover scooter, a space-age flying carpet. But the cost of building it takes away the magic. 1969, the Concorde takes flight. The world's first supersonic passenger jet flies up to Mach 2 and does Paris to New York in 3.5 hours. It's a lawman's dream. Bring the bad guy to his knees with a non-lethal zap. A grown-up invention that got its start in childhood fantasy. In the 1920s, young Jack Cover can't get enough of his favorite book.
Okay, Mom.
It's called Tom Swift and His Electric Rifle, about a boy who can neutralize bad guys without killing them. A kid's story with a real-life future. Jack grows up, gets a PhD in nuclear physics, then changes course, drawn into the brave new world of aerospace technology.
He just was really effusive with both energy and intellect. He's one of these people who just had to be on the move, was always looking for new intellectual challenges and new adventures in life.
By the late 60s, Jack's in California, a chief scientist involved in America's race to get a man on the moon. But it's the down-to-earth news that's really sparking his imagination.
Can you believe what's going on in Chicago?
Race riots and anti-war protests have been tearing the country apart.
In the 1960s, this country was torn apart over the Vietnam War. There were protests that were turning violent across this country. And at the same time, we had the rise of hijackings and terrorism. So it was a violent and unpredictable world that was emerging in the 1960s.
And it must
President Johnson is calling for the development of a non-lethal weapon to subdue protesters without killing them. In the same paper, Jack also notices a strange, unrelated story.
Paper, he reads an article about a man who's walking through the woods who goes to climb over a fence, and apparently that fence had been hit by a power line, and just enough electricity was flowing through the fence and through this man that he couldn't let go.
The man was temporarily incapacitated, but not injured.
And I believe that was the eureka moment where Jack said, well, the country needs a safer way to subdue people so you don't have to kill them. Electricity can immobilize, and yet people can recover fully. Why don't we take electricity, combine it back with my boyhood memories of Tom Swift and his electric rifle? He had the vision of how to solve a major problem.
Jack arms himself with the most up-to-date science on electricity and the body, and starts building a prototype with bits and pieces from his garage.
Jack would take ordinary parts, sometimes as simple as a tongue depressor or a rubber band, and do extraordinary things with them. Bicycle tire valves and some plastic tubing and some other parts, and next thing you know, he's got an advanced ballistic cartridge system for firing electrified electrodes.
Jack hopes that by firing at a living target, he can temporarily jam that body's own electric signals.
Inside my body, as I'm sitting here right now, there are trillions of electrical impulses moving through the nerve fibers back and forth between my brain and every sensor in my skin. They control all of my muscular movements, my sight, my smell. Every sensation in the human body are electric signals that are being transmitted around within the body.
His device will use electricity stored in a battery. Gunpowder charges will fire 2 insulated wires with darts on the end. When both darts hit the target, the electrical circuit is completed, delivering a shock that temporarily disables the body.
I can shut you down like a Star Trek phaser. I can stop your brain from being able to control your body so that you can't attack me, you can't harm me. But like a light switch, when I turn it off, you return right back to normal.
Jack calculates the combination of voltage and current required for any given target. Enough to make muscles contract, but not enough to damage the body.
So once they've built the first tasers, they've done the engineering calculations. Of course, they need to then begin testing them, and that would include some animal tests.
One of Jack's first test subjects is a buffalo from a local animal park.
Jack was able to take a buffalo, put it safely on the ground, and yet allow it to get right back up, back to normal immediately.
There's only one way to take testing to the next level.
There's nothing that speaks to the safety of a product like an inventor who's willing to use it himself.
So Jack steps into the line of fire with a little help from his sons. So far, so good.
When his sons saw that example, they too stepped up. They were part of this taser mission as well, and they also volunteered to take this.
They're only the first tests of hundreds, but Jack Cover knows he's invented a super effective, non-lethal weapon. He names his invention for the childhood fantasy that started it all. He uses the book's title to create an acronym: TASER. It takes another 2 decades and lots of modifications before mainstream law enforcers start using the device.
Jack was excited to see it finally take off. It had been a long, hard road for him, and to see law enforcement adopting the taser en masse around the world was a nice capstone for his life.
Today, the taser is used in 44 countries by police and military personnel. Thanks to a maverick scientist who wasn't afraid to take the first hit. Also invented in the 60s. 1969. The ground proximity warning system alerts pilots so they can ascend quickly to avoid a crash.
But it's far superior to what we had before, which was nothing.
1968. The jacuzzi turns the tub into a sizzly social. The dolphin does your exercise for you.
All the pleasures of swimming without the exertion.
Trouble is, most people would rather swim. It's made werewolves howl and lunatics prowl. Myths about the moon have enthralled us since we lived in caves. But no lunar legend compares to the true story of that leggy little spaceship that took us there for real. May 25th, 1961. In Bethpage, New York, aerospace engineer Tom Kelly and his wife are among tens of millions of Americans glued to their TV sets.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
President Kennedy's speech is a rallying cry. America's arch rival, the Soviet Union, has been chalking up one victory after another in the Cold War space race.
The Soviets had demonstrated over and over again from the late 1950s all the way to 1961 that they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, or so it seemed, in space. They'd been the first to launch a satellite. They'd been the first to send a robotic probe to the moon. They'd been the first to photograph the back side of the moon. They were the first in 1961 to send a human into orbit. All of those firsts suggest that they were perhaps the world leader.
We nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own.
America desperately needs its own first to one-up the Soviets music to Tom Kelly's ears and to his bosses at Grumman Aerospace, a company that builds jet fighters.
Going to another body in the solar system, putting an astronaut safely on it, and learning about it, heck, there's nothing better than that. And that's how Tom Kelly and the folks who were on his team thought about it.
Tom's company wants in on the action, but they have to convince NASA that they have a winning idea. Should a rocket fly astronauts directly to the moon? Or should a mothership orbit the Earth and launch them from there? Tom Kelly's team favors a third concept. The mothership or command module orbits the moon, not the Earth. One astronaut waits in orbit while 2 others descend to the moon in a separate vehicle, then rendezvous with the mothership.
Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was very controversial at the time. There were a lot of people who didn't think it would work. They thought it was far too risky and that their chances of stranding somebody on the lunar surface was too great and didn't want to go that route.
But Tom helps convince decision makers it's the only way to go. His company wins the contract to build the vehicle that will actually land on the moon.
NASA engineers and corporate engineers, including Tom Kelly from Grumman, were able to convince the higher-ups that this was really the only way we could do it.
Tom's put in charge, and his brilliant mind goes into overdrive. He knows the lunar vehicle won't look like the jet fighters his company usually builds. The new invention will fly only in low gravity. What's needed is a vehicle straight out of science fiction. But how to build a machine in a lab that will never actually work in Earth's atmosphere? And how to design landing gear when you're not even sure what kind of surface it's landing on? The design morphs into an insect-like structure with long legs.
The legs of the lunar module have to do 2 important things. The first thing they have to do is they have to absorb the shock of the landing. They're also long and gangly in case there is some dust that you might sink into, still be above that with the major part of the spacecraft.
Another challenge, maneuvering the lunar module once it leaves the mothership. A propulsion system on the bottom, known as the descent stage of the vehicle, will help it land on the moon. A second propulsion system will separate the top of the vehicle, or the ascent stage, so it can take off from the lunar surface.
Now we have to build it.
January 1963, construction of the lunar lander begins. One huge challenge, keeping weight to an absolute minimum.
Anything that flies, weight is the primary consideration. And with the lunar module, it's especially the case because it had to go to the lunar surface and then back up, and you only had a certain amount of throw weight with the rocket to be able to do those things.
So Tom Kelly's team strips the lunar lander to its bare essentials. They redesign the interior so there's no need for seats.
The seats in the lunar module first were tossed because of the weight. There's just no question about that. They were also big and bulky. They didn't see any reason that they had to have them. The astronauts were not going to be in there that long. They were just going to essentially ride it down to the lunar surface so they could stand while they're doing that.
They replace large windows with a small one.
The glass is very heavy, and over time they realized that they didn't need to have that much picture window space.
Tests prove that the vehicle can land safely with 4 legs instead of 5.
When you're doing major engineering problems, it's all about finding solutions to problems. It's a real delicate task, and Kelly was a master at it.
By 1967, the lunar module has taken shape. Astronauts are busy training how to use it and the command module. Then, on January 27th, 1967, disaster.
What?
A command module simulator caught fire, killing 3 astronauts during training.
It was a devastating setback. For the first time in the program, astronauts in the line of duty in a spacecraft were killed.
The tragedy sends shockwaves through America's space program, leaving the future of the moon mission in doubt. NASA spends months rethinking. For Tom Kelly and the team building the lunar module, it's a sharp reminder. If scientists overlook even one small detail, the astronauts may never come home. Training intensifies. Astronauts are put through their paces in zero gravity.
The astronauts had to learn to fly the lunar module on Earth, but they would never fly it in a gravity environment or with an atmosphere in real life. So they had to build vehicles that simulated what the lunar module was going to be like when it flew in space.
So they build this machine to simulate what it feels like to fly the lunar module. Training is risky. Some vehicles crash. Sometimes astronauts have to bail out by parachute. But by 1969, they've successfully finished their Earthbound training. Next, the lunar lander is tested in space, launched into Earth's orbit so scientists can do a final check on everything, from engines to docking mechanisms. Now, it's all systems go for the ultimate challenge. July 16th, 1969, the mighty Saturn V rocket is on the launch pad. Tom Kelly and his team are among the thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians whose futures are riding on what happens next. The biggest rocket of all time blasts the lunar lander and the command module toward the moon. A few hundred kilometers above the Earth's surface, the command module separates from the rocket. It turns 180 degrees and pulls the lunar lander out of the rocket's storage bay. When the vehicles enter the moon's orbit, the lunar lander detaches and begins its rapid descent down to the surface.
Go for landing. 60 seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
As Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin do their moonwalk, Tom Kelly's with them every step of the way.
It's fascinating what the lunar module was able to accomplish as it took us to another world. It shaped our understanding of the cosmos, our understanding of the solar system. The lunar module shaped the world by helping us change our perspective on the universe.
And it gave us license to think even bigger about ever more challenging journeys into the universe. And so end the swinging 60s in what is the most innovative century the world has ever known.